Welcome to the 20th Annual Brattleboro Literary Festival. I'm Stephanie Green, a writer and member of Brattleboro Literary Festival's organizing committee. We are delighted today to present Dorothy Wickenden, author of Nothing Daunted and the Agitators. You can submit questions to Dorothy via the Q&A button on your screen. If your question has already been submitted, click the thumbs up icon to upvote the question. There will be links in the chat to purchase the book and to donate to the festival. And a special thank you to our sponsors. Dorothy Wickenden is the author of Nothing Daunted and the Agitators, three friends who fought for abolition and women's rights, and has been the executive editor of The New Yorker since January 1996. She also writes for the magazine and is the moderator of its weekly podcast, The Political Scene. A former Nieman Fellow at Harvard, Wickenden was National Affairs Editor at Newsweek from 1993 to 1995, and before that was the longtime Executive Editor at The New Republic. She lives with her husband in Westchester, New York. The Agitators, three friends who fought for abolition and women's rights, tells the story of America before the Civil War through the lives of three women. Harriet Tubman rescued some 70 enslaved people from Maryland's eastern shore and shepherded them north along the Underground Railroad. One of her regular stops was Auburn, New York, where she entrusted passengers to Martha Coffin Wright, a Quaker mother of 7, and Frances Seward, the wife of William H. Seward, who served over the years as governor, senator from New York, and Secretary of State under Abraham Lincoln. During the Civil War, Tubman worked for the Union Army in South Carolina as a nurse and a spy and took part in a spectacular river raid in which she helped liberate 750 slaves from several rice plantations. Welcome, Dorothy.
Thank you so much, Stephanie.
Well, I just have to say this book has it all. Big ideas, fascinating people, compelling details, and lots of daring do. So my first question is, how did you choose these three women to write about?
Yeah, it was really a serendipitous encounter, which happened. It occurred when I was actually doing research for my previous book, Nothing Daunted, which was about my grandmother and her best friend, both of whom grew up in Auburn, New York. I had never been to the town before. And so I was checking out her claim that her grandparents lived next door to the Sewards. And so I went to the Seward House Museum, and that claim was verified. And then the young education director took me on a private tour, and it was immediately apparent to me that she didn't want to talk about the famous, probably the second most famous statesman of the 19th century, William H. Seward, but about his very quiet, recessive wife, Frances, who was dismissed by Seward's first biographer as a neurotic invalid. So this young woman took me down the basement stairs, this narrow, dark staircase into the house's original basement kitchen. And that was where Frances Seward, she told me, hid fugitive slaves on the Underground Railroad. And so I just thought that alone was fascinating. So I started asking her questions. And then she said, oh yeah, and around the corner, her best friend lived, Martha Coffin Wright, who, as this woman put it, put the funny into feminism. And they used to get together often at Frances's house because Martha would borrow books from her wonderful library, and they'd conspire together, and they'd talk about men and about how women had no rights and how slavery needed to be overturned. So those two women sounded incredible. And then she said, oh, and Harriet Tubman lived just a mile down the street. So I just thought, that was all so amazing, but I was involved in working on my previous book. So then I stumbled on another story about my grandmother's best friend from one of her descendants who still lived in Auburn, who said, the story in our family was when Rosamond, my grandmother's friend, and Dorothy, my grandmother, were 4 or 5, they were standing on the street outside the Seward house one day, and Harriet Tubman rode by on a bicycle. So that led to the question, how did Harriet Tubman, this woman who spent the first 27 years of her life enslaved on the Eastern Shore, come to live for almost 50 years in Auburn, New York?
Yeah.
So I had to kind of put that aside while I finished that other book. And then that was what I just had to answer that question. And to answer the question about Tubman, I had to get to know much more about the collaboration between her and these two white women in Auburn.
Oh, that's fabulous. So what year did they see her on the bicycle? That blows my mind.
Well, it blows my mind too. The 2 degrees of separation, basically. It was probably the late 1880s when Harriet Tubman, also it wasn't a bicycle, I later found out. I mean, if you think about it, and one of Tubman's descendants, who still lives in Auburn, told me, I don't think so. I'm sure it was a horse and cart. But everybody in Auburn, including these little girls, knew who Harriet Tubman was because she was this war hero, and she was an old woman, but she entertained the children of Auburn, who always, whenever she stopped, she knew everyone in Auburn. She made it her business because she was always fundraising for whatever project she was working on, which she worked on until her death. And so the children would always come to her, and she was called Aunt Harriet. Aunt Harriet, Aunt Harriet, tell us one of your stories. So there are records of her sitting down with the children of Auburn and telling these stories. So these little girls would have known immediately who she was.
Oh, that's so great. So you say in the book, I found this a stunning statement, that so much of American history is moved by unknown people, is sort of marched along. And following the lives of unknown participants or previously unknown participants in history, that must present special challenges. Can you talk about that?
It's real big challenges and also big rewards, I would say. And this was where my experience working on the earlier book was incredibly helpful, because that book was based on the letters home from my grandmother and her best friend, which I found when they were on the western slope of Colorado, teaching the children of homesteaders for a year. And their letters were so vivid. And I got to know all the children by name, and I got to know about the landscape and these towns. And there was this incredible kidnapping in a mining town. So I learned there what you could learn. It was like an alternate history of the Wild West through the eyes of these well-bred young, Eastern women. So my immediate impulse when I started reading about Frances Seward, the little there was of her in the biographies about her famous husband, I found out that all of the letters of the Seward family are at the University of Rochester library, and they're all there. And I went to Rochester and I started reading Frances's letters, and they just blew my mind. I mean, they were such a gift to any researcher, especially since they essentially sat there for hundreds of years untouched.
Mm-hmm.
And so imagine Frances insisted on living in Auburn for most for her entire life, actually. And she only went down to Washington when Seward was first he was a US Senator, and then he was Secretary of State to Lincoln. She only went down there for a month or two every year. So they communicated with each other by letters. And she was very recessive and didn't like the public life at all. But boy, when she disagreed with her husband, she really told him. And she was an abolitionist. He was an anti-slavery politician, so he was much more careful. And she was constantly pushing him to go farther than he was willing to go. Henry, listen to your conscience.
Right.
So the letters are just stunning. And I couldn't believe that this woman had basically been lost to history. And then it turns out Martha Coffin Wright did indeed put the funny into feminism. I went to her collection of letters, which are at Smith College, started reading those. And there is one biography that had been written about her and quoted quite liberally from the letters. And they indeed, many of them were hilarious in a very sardonic, biting way. And I just thought, this is great, to see how everyone at the time thought women were basically just these domestic servants, just stay in the kitchen, take care of the children, bake your bread, and be quiet. And they had to do everything their husbands taught them. They told them they had to do, because they had no rights under the law. So to see what women were writing about in these letters, about their husbands and about what they did every day, changing the straw in the mattresses. Indeed, Martha had 6 children, what it took to get these children, out of bed and in to school, and the babies and the, washing, which took 3 hours every morning. I mean, it was just a complete nightmare. And of course, Martha hated it. She had no servants. She had one woman to help her in the kitchen. But this is 6 children. She had to make by hand all of the family clothes because there were no sewing machines. So it just boggles the modern mind, really. And her resentment built and built until she did something about it in 1848 when she was one of the organizers of the Seneca Falls Convention.
No, I was stunned by her recitation of her daily work, where she got up before dawn and she went to bed at 11 or 12 at night after working all day long.
Long after her hardworking husband had gone to sleep. Yeah.
Oh yeah. No, remarkable. The vividness of the scenes that come through their writing is really extraordinary. And I recall Frances Seward's was for a while a close friend of Charles Sumner, and her dismay at his beating, when Preston Brooks clobbered him with that walking stick on the Senate floor, and really, really hurt him. It's a perspective we don't often get to see in history books, for sure. But I think you've accomplished what fiction and creative nonfiction do best, which is help the reader experience the times you describe.
Well, then I succeeded. That's really nice of you to say so. I wanted it to be, because if you read standard histories by historians who have been trained, they don't tell narratives because they've been trained not to do that. And that has an effect of distancing from the characters. And I wanted readers to really feel what it was like to live in this time, and to live in a time where all of the rules and laws of society were being challenged by very tiny minorities of people, women's rights advocates and abolitionists who were completely despised by everyone else in society. Nevertheless, over the years, they were the ones who began, as were, enslaved people who were leaving the South and were being brought north by Harriet Tubman, among others. So the entire underpinnings of American society were changing. So this is why this is when you have firsthand accounts of this is just a gift. And Frances wrote, so Sumner became her only friend in Washington. She hated Washington, she hated politics, but she thought Sumner was, different from all the other politicians because he was an abolitionist and he was very outspoken, much more so than her husband. So she became really close to him, and they wrote letters all the time. So I had her side of the correspondence. And she wrote to a friend after the beating of Charles Sumner, who was almost killed. I mean, he was carried unconscious off the Senate floor. And there were men with pistols standing nearby, not allowing anybody to help him. It's just so horrifying. So imagine what this meant to Frances, who was one of her dearest friends. And she wrote to a friend in the North, "The events of this winter have deepened that furor in my soul." And, this effectively was the beginning of the Civil War. I mean, it was bleeding Kansas. There were, uprisings. There were battles between North and South, and Kansas, which was trying to enter the Union as a state. So then I went to Charles Sumner's letters, which are at Harvard University, to see what he wrote to Frances. And so that confirmed how close they were. And so I had both sides of that correspondence too. And there have been wonderful accounts of Charles Sumner by David Herbert Donald, foremost among them, whom I studied with briefly at Harvard when I was a Nieman Fellow, and he was writing a biography of Lincoln. But he also wrote these 2 biographies of Charles Sumner, which are wildly entertaining in their way, because he he was such a critic of Sumner, who was vain and pompous and self-regarding, and his colleagues couldn't stand him. So Frances, who was so discerning and such an astute judge of character, she just put all that aside when it came to Sumner because she agreed with him politically. So again, that's just a complicated, interesting, kind of touching dynamic to me, how she was willing to excuse him for all of his personal failings because she thought he was such an honorable man.
Mm-hmm. Oh, yeah. And I was also struck by how beautifully each of these three women expressed themselves. And even though Harriet Tubman was illiterate, possibly due to the injuries sustained as a slave, the head injuries, and was a riveting storyteller. And as you said before we opened up to the public about, or maybe not, the everyone calling her Auntie Harriet, tell us a story, tell us a story. And Martha Wright was so funny, and Frances was really nuanced and subtle. Was their ability with language part of what moved you to write about them? I mean, they really were
Yes,
excellent.
it absolutely was. And it wasn't something that I necessarily expected, except that I had been given that little hint from the education director at the Seward House Museum about Martha and her gift with words, because not everybody is a great letter writer, and not even heroes don't necessarily have the gift. Harriet Tubman had a gift for performance among her many other incredible traits. And so Tubman, unfortunately, for reasons that are clear if you follow her whole biography, she never learned to read and write. So, but I believe she wanted her story to be written down and remembered. And the way she did that was telling her friends the same stories about her upbringing and about her incredible feats over and over again. And so that is basically, in addition to the scholarly work that's been done about Tubman, that's how I pieced together her biography. I kept trying to think, how did Harriet Tubman think, and what did she think about what she was doing? And so I went back to the accounts. The closest you could get was the contemporaneous accounts of friends in the North who would write down, immediately after she left their house or after she had given a big public address, they would write down what she had said. And they would, invariably, they were just completely mesmerized by her and so impressed with her courage. I mean, so women, and she was so savvy about how she told her story. So when she was talking to women, white women, and remember, she had no money. So the way she earned money was by fundraising. So she started out when she was in the North in Boston, once she got to know the kind of wealthy abolitionist clique in Boston, she would be invited to a woman's house, usually a woman, and she would tell her stories, and then the women there would donate to her. So one of the stories she quickly found they loved hearing was about how she had left on her own. She liberated herself from slavery when she was 27. She spent 2 years in Philadelphia earning enough money so that she could go back and bring her husband north with her. He was a free Black man. He wouldn't leave with her when she left because he thought it was too dangerous. He was sure they were going to be captured and they would both be killed or severely punished. So he wouldn't go with her. She left alone. She went back for him, and she brought with her a clean set of new clothes so that he would have something respectable to wear with her when she took him back north. And she got word to him that she was there. And he sent word back to her saying he didn't want to see her. He had taken another wife. And imagine, she had spent 2 years thinking of nothing but him and how they could finally start a family. And she tells the story to white women, and wealthy white women who had everything they could ever, imagine needing, who left her husband. They had their own unfaithful husbands. It would never occur to them to leave their husbands. So, and of course, Frances and Martha were among those who heard these stories and just were complete. And this was a woman who had a very a driving set of beliefs, and she lived by them. And she could not help but make Frances and Martha feel that they had to act on their beliefs too. Imagine how inspiring she was to them.
Oh, amazing, amazing. Now, the General Tubman, as she was called, was this at Port Royal or as a result of Port Royal, never led a regiment, but she did spend 3 years of the Civil War in Port Royal, South Carolina, as a spy for the Union Army. Could you talk a bit about that and the amazing raid that freed 750 slaves?
Well, and that's one of my favorite episodes in the book. And it was something that I certainly never learned in, 8th grade history class. We all heard about Harriet Tubman, the Underground Railroad. She got like 2 paragraphs and that was that. Yes, American hero. So she told, and again, here to piece the story together, this is where it was really fun. So Harriet Tubman told Martha before she left, and I know this from one of Martha's letters, that she was going down to Port Royal, South Carolina, which was occupied by Union troops, to perform a kind of secret service. And so Martha wasn't exactly sure what that meant. But indeed, Harriet Tubman ingratiated herself. She knew enough people in Boston that she got an audience with the governor. With the governor of Massachusetts, who gave her permission to go behind, military lines, sent her down to Port Royal with an introduction to some of the officers down there. She immediately got to know all of the officers who were, and the local population, which comprised of 10,000 newly freed, they were called contrabands at the time, newly freed slaves. So they desperately needed help. And there were all kinds of private operations underway, and Harriet helped them too. And she also hired, with the money she got from these officers, money to pay a group of 8 scouts who went into sort of the outlying areas of where they all were, because they were surrounded on 3 sides by Confederate troops, and the Confederates were constantly moving, and so they needed to know, the Union troops needed to know where the Confederates were. So it was an incredibly important intelligence, and she got to know all of these officers really well. So they were just beginning a series of raids along the rivers. So that part of Georgia and South Carolina is just infiltrated with rivers. And so there were many rice plantations along the rivers. And they were developing the series of river raids. And Harriet Tubman was asked by one of the abolitionist colonels to go with him on the most ambitious raid during the war, which was led by him on the lead gunboat. Harriet Tubman was on the lead gunboat. There were 2 other boats behind them, steamers. They went up the Combahee River. They stopped at 3 different landings, and they had this whole sort of method where they would, the soldiers would get off the boats and they'd go inland. They'd do these surprise attacks. They would torch the plantations. And the word had gotten to the enslaved people that, as Harriet Tubman said, the Yankees had come to set them free. So then they'd run down to the landing while there was total chaos on the plantations, and Harriet Tubman and others would help them on the gunboats. So it's an absolutely phenomenal thing. And they did bring back with them 750 freed men, women, and children. And just think, when Harriet Tubman was leading her own modest expeditions onto the Eastern Shore, the most people she ever came back with was a dozen, and that was a lot. Usually it was 3 or 4 people. So she told her first biographer in 1868 in detail about how this took place. So we have that record.
Wow.
And she told her friends about it. And she had one of her close friends in Boston was the editor of an abolitionist newspaper. And so she dictated a letter when she was in Port Royal. She was so proud of this, of course. Here she is, a Black woman, not long escaped from slavery, helping to lead a raid in the Civil War. It's just, and
Yeah.
Black soldiers had just been admitted into the armed services. So it's just a phenomenal thing. So she wrote this letter, she dictated it and to this friend, and she said, don't you think that we Negroes are that we should be applauded, and with our brave Colonel Montgomery for this feat of this rescue operation. And so this guy, immediately prints it in the paper. He's got this incredible scoop. So you can kind of take all these little tidbits and put them together. And when you put them together, it's quite an amazing story.
It is phenomenal. Absolutely. Um, Harriet, Frances, and Martha were all harsh critics of the Lincoln administration's initial policy to save the Union, not to emancipate slaves. So, how did they express themselves on this point? And was Harriet in particular did she have any, did her opinion eventually flow to Lincoln, or how did that work?
Well, I wish it had flown directly to Lincoln. I don't think he knew who Frederick Douglass was. Absolutely, that Frederick Douglass was one of Martha's closest friends, because Douglass visited him at the White House twice. And Harriet Tubman, after the war, had an opportunity to go to the White House, and it was right before. It was right before the war. I'm forgetting the exact date. Sojourner Truth asked her to go with her to the White House, and she refused to go because she didn't believe that Lincoln would actually do what he promised to do, and that the slaves would be liberated. So let me just see, in my beginning of my book, there's this great quote from her. January 1862, which is not even a year into the war. And she said, this is what she told a close friend in Boston, one of her women friends and a philanthropist. God's ahead of Master Lincoln. God won't let Master Lincoln beat the South till he does the right thing. Master Lincoln, he's a great man, and I'm a poor Negro, but this Negro can tell Master Lincoln how to save the money and the young men. He can do it by setting the Negroes free. So, again, it's just, she was so remarkable, and she never vacillated. Martha and Frances worried that the North was going to lose the war. Harriet, once Black men were allowed to fight, had no doubt that they were going to win the war. She just thought, they had to be allowed into the army, and then they were going to win. And indeed, that was the turning point in the war.
Right. Right. Weren't there like something all told, like 200,000 Black troops
It
in
was
the
a lot.
Union?
Yes, I don't have the numbers on the off the top of my head, but it was a lot, and they fought heroically. And this was the thing: Lincoln and others had no idea. You put a gun in their hands. Who can guarantee that these men will fight? Well, Harriet was down in Beaufort, South Carolina, where the first Black troops were being formed, and she watched the training. And the colonels who were the white colonels who were abolitionists, who were in charge of these regiments, these first two regiments, they too wrote about the extraordinary will and determination of these men who had 10 days ago been enslaved, and their belief in the American flag and the Declaration of Independence. It just makes you weep. And they helped the North win the war.
Yes, absolutely. Absolutely. It's so moving. It really is. And, it was at the end of Frances Seward's life. It was such a poignant coming of full circle and ironic that Charles Wilson made of Frances's life. I'm going to read just a little bit, and you can rebut it. um, the Chicago Journal published a long appreciation by the publisher Charles L. Wilson of Frances Seward at her death, who had been secretary of the American legation in London during the war. Wilson portrayed Frances as Henry liked to see her. Quote, she believed that women would be accorded a wider and freer action in the future than was usual in the past. Yet she did not feel called by this conviction to eccentricities in dress, nor to haranguing public assemblies. And, you know, he totally, totally misses who she was and what she did. And if you want, you can.
Completely. And again, that would have driven her absolutely insane. And it was, that was the view of an enlightened white man. And of course, that's what he would have thought. He had no idea that Frances had sold Harriet Tubman a house, a mile down the road in Auburn before the war, so that Harriet could settle her family there. Okay, so she didn't do it the way public men did it. She did it in her own way. She did everything she could to help. And I had an inkling that you were going to read that, because I knew that had enraged you as it did me. And you talk about the importance of these letters. So Martha, of course, and the funeral and everything else, she knew this woman very, very well for decades. And she wrote to her sister Lucretia Mott, the great human rights activist, Quaker minister. And so looking back, and she was, of course, just deeply felt the tragedy, not only of Frances's death, but of a life that made her just deeply unhappy, married to this politician and living away from him for most of their years. So Martha wrote to her sister Lucretia, citing the 1,000 anxieties that have pressed upon her. And she said, I will miss her gentle presence and the eternal interest she felt in the right. And then she said, Frances was relieved at last of the honorables and the gents and the majors and the never failing attendance on the great, because Seward himself just loved all these high and mighty people that he hung out with. And then she wrote, poor Mrs. Seward sleeps well, untortured by the restless ambitions of others. And again, only a close friend would have said such a thing.
Right. And what a treasure to have that opinion. It really is. I had another question about the women's push for the vote, and how there was kind of a split, well, very much of a split, between Elizabeth Cady Stanton and
Susan B. Anthony.
Susan B. Anthony, thank you. And the abolitionists with whom they had worked for years and years and years. Can you talk about that a bit?
Yes, and that was a huge blow to Martha, among others, because Martha fought side by side with Elizabeth Cady Stanton and Susan B. Anthony. She was, in effect, their deputy, and they counted on her for her wit and her wisdom. They were total bomb throwers, and she would always try to say, I think there might be a better way to do this. She'd brought up this large family, and she knew how to kind of how to put a lid on things. So they began to get extremely nervous during the discussions over the 14th and 15th Amendments, where more rights were being, including the vote, were being discussed for Black men. And Elizabeth Cady Stanton and Susan B. Anthony, who were middle-class white women with a rather limited perspective on race, they had never been outright racist before. But now, when they saw that Congress was likely to give the vote to Black men, but not to women, white women, in their perspective, they just lost it, and they went all out racist. And this was so painful to Martha. She wrote to her husband David, I don't like what they're doing at all, but I'm loyal to my friends, even when they do choose to do unwise things. And they had been always close to Frederick Douglass, who finally lost his temper with them, and he gave a scorching speech, in contradicting them and saying, this is just complete folly, and who needs the vote more immediately? Of course women need the vote, but who needs it right now? And this was after the Civil War, and when Reconstruction, fell apart, and the KKK was, lynching Black men. I mean, it was just so obvious what needed to be done, and Congress couldn't possibly do these two things at once. Right. So, and then listening to that speech or reading that speech, Martha wasn't there. She writes to her husband, David, I thought Douglas's remarks were good. So she was caught in the middle. This was just a terrible break between, these two groups that had worked really so closely, so long, especially in the pre-war years, because the women's rights activists really learned everything they knew about activism from the abolitionists who had started their movement before they had. And they would ask these speakers to come in, and they both had their conventions on the same days so that people could go to both. So it was a terrible split, and it took decades really for it to heal.
Do you think that slowed up the women getting suffrage?
That is a really good question. I don't know, because what happened was Susan B. Anthony and Elizabeth Cady Stanton, and then reluctantly Martha, started one group that pushed for women's rights, and then Lucy Stone and her husband Henry Blackwell and some of those abolitionists who believed that Black men should get the vote first, and which is what happened. They fought in their own way for women's suffrage. So I think all of them were quite realistic once it became clear that this was that they were not going to get the vote immediately, that it was going to take a very long time. And so all of these women had died by the time women achieved suffrage nationally.
Yeah.
And there many of their daughters and granddaughters were then active in the cause.
Mm-hmm. There was another very striking scene, I guess, during Reconstruction, in which Harriet Tubman was riding on, was it a train or some kind of trolley, and the conductor wanted her to go back to the smoking section where Blacks were supposed to be, and she refused and was injured. And was that widely reported, and did it horrify too many people? I mean,
It was reported at the time, but probably the only people who would have paid any attention, frankly, were abolitionists and left-leaning, as we would now put it, people who knew who she was. And that happened right after the war, actually. She had been working, after she was in Port Royal, she'd been working in one of the Army hospitals at Fort Monroe, and she'd learned to be a nurse, during the war. That was one of her many skills. And so she was working with wounded Black soldiers. And so she'd gotten a half-price ticket and was heading north. She had stopped in Philadelphia, had seen Lucretia Mott, and then continued on her way to Brooklyn, where she was going to give a talk. And while she was on her way, a conductor came and took her ticket, and he said, "Get out of here. We don't carry, the N-word for half fare." And she said, "I won't." And she was incredibly strong. She was tiny but strong, and she grabbed onto the seat, and he had to get two other male passengers to wrench her hands away. They basically it sounds like they broke her wrist and one of her ribs, and threw her physically into the smoking car. But before they did, she said, "And don't you call me a colored woman. I am a Black woman, and I am just as proud of my race as you are of yours." And I just thought, who is this guy? What have you done to help your country in the past 4 years? You're talking about a war hero.
Yeah. Oh, absolutely. We have opened up both the chat section and the Q&A section for questions and comments from the audience. So please feel free, and I will pose them to Dorothy. Another, well, there's so many wonderful scenes, but another thing I had never known about was the Jerry rescue. Could you talk about that?
Well, so that there were a number of these rescues of fugitive slaves after the Fugitive Slave Act of 1850 passed, which made it legal for Southerners to travel into northern states and seize men and women whom they claimed to be their property. And this was a cause of outrage across the North, including among people who were not formerly interested or appalled by slavery, particularly. They didn't pay any attention to it, but slavery had long since been outlawed in the North. And the New York State in particular, and Boston as well, had a number of these rescues. So the Jerry rescue took place in Syracuse, and Syracuse was one of these cities that was sort of partly made up of conservative New Yorkers, businessmen and farmers, and partly made up of Black men and women, many of whom had escaped slavery and established lives as workers in the city. And they were neighbors of their white people who lived nearby. So he was at work one day. He was a barrel maker, and a slave catcher, accompanied by a couple of local constables, seized him and took him into custody. And all of these cities, which had sizable numbers of underground railroad operatives, would send out a call. And so in Syracuse, the church bells began to ring, and soon the churches all over the city, the bells were ringing. And that was a call that all the activists knew meant that a fugitive slave had been captured and was about to be sent back to the South. So they found out where he was, and there was a hardware store owner, and he put out axes and big rods and things outside for the taking, for people who wanted to take part in the rescue, which they did. They arrived at the police station. They battered down the door. They rescued Jerry. He was then taken back, and then later that night, they actually succeeded. They took him to a different spot, and they found out where he was, and they battered down the door again, and they rescued him. So this was Daniel Webster had visited Syracuse before this and warned anyone who defied the fugitive slave law that this was an outrage, and Syracuse was a laboratory of abolitionism and radicalism. But Jerry was taken out of town on the first stage by a white butcher who formerly had been very conservative, but he was so furious that the feds had invaded their land. He put him in the back of his meat wagon, covered him up with a cloth, and rode him out of town. And then he was taken to various stops, and eventually he got into a ship and sailed across Lake Ontario into Canada.
Wow. Wow. Now, Harriet Tubman's parents, she eventually rescued them. Did they go all the way to Canada, or did
They did, and that was Tubman said to one of her friends in Canada that after the fugitive slave law passed, she wouldn't trust Uncle Sam with my people any longer. So she took them across New York State, and Auburn was right in the middle of New York State. So the Martha hid fugitive slaves in her basement kitchen, as Frances did in hers. So they were one of the stops on the Underground Railroad. And Tubman's parents were like 75, but she took, most of the people who escaped from slavery were young men, who could stand the rigors of the journey. She took them all the way to Canada, and then they hated it up there. It was so cold. It was a foreign country. They never saw their daughter. So that was when Frances had decided, well, I have some property that I've inherited, and I would like Harriet Tubman to have this barn and house and 7 acres on South Street in Auburn. And so in 1859, she sold that property to Harriet Tubman. And again, another unbelievable thing to do at the time. She herself was violating the Fugitive Slave Act.
Yeah. So, you know, it was quite a risk, even in Auburn, to provide sanctuary for runaway slaves. Were there any kind of were there raids on any of these Underground Railroad stops? Or any of
Not as far that, not as far as I know, because it was much less dangerous as the 1850s went on, because people were so outraged by that law. But early on, you know, when Martha started hiding slaves in her basement kitchen in I think in starting in 1843.
Wow.
And so people always came after dark and they left before dawn. The Underground Railroad was just such an extraordinarily successful undertaking. I mean, it operated almost without flaws for 50 years. And it was
Wow.
because everyone was so incredibly careful. So you would, as a fugitive slave, you would stop at one house and then you would be given the directions only to the next house. So there were just precautions taken so that there wouldn't be any betrayals. And so as far as I know, in Auburn, there were no one ever found out. And Frances Seward was so deeply discreet about everything she did. Her neighbors had no idea what she was doing.
Yeah, yeah. Now, were both women, Martha and Frances, and then I have some questions upcoming from the audience, but I get to jump the line here. Uh, both of the women were they equally, I don't know, active on the Underground Railroad, Frances and Martha?
Yes, I would say just about equally. And Frances, in addition, would do, and I'm sure, and Martha did too. You were expected, if you were going to be providing this aid, that if someone came to your house and said, you know, I need $15 to get to the next, station stop, you would give the money. But Frances, sometimes people would stay longer in Auburn, and she would begin to teach these fugitive slaves to read and write. She hired some of them. She provided one as the war went on and things was about to begin. She provided one with a pistol. You know, she was really active. And interestingly, after Harriet Tubman died, Harriet Tubman lived way, into the 20th century. And after she died, there's this, I found this letter in the local paper from a local African-American who wanted, Harriet Tubman got this amazing military funeral. It was fantastic. And then this letter was written by this African-American man. And he said, I would like to also thank Frances Seward. Most people don't know it, but every African-American person in Auburn knew who she was and knew all of the help she had given to people who needed her help whenever it was asked. And he said on numberless occasions, Mrs. Seward has come to the rescue of the Black people of Auburn, where her memory will always be kept green and her deeds will never die. So again, it's fascinating that the Black people of Auburn knew exactly whom to turn to, and the white people of Auburn were completely clueless.
Yeah, isn't that funny? Well, Bonnie Claus remarks that Dorothy's knowledge and enthusiasm for her subject are contagious. Her book sounds wonderful. It is, Bonnie. Go buy several copies. It was excellent, excellent book. I want to ask you about Harriet Tubman's niece, Margaret, and
Mhm.
that story and what happened to her.
And that is it is still a mysterious story. And I love that story. So her niece, Margaret Stewart, so-called niece, where this is still in dispute, she too lived in the house down the street once Frances sold it to her. Harriet had taken this girl and brought her north, and she referred to her as her niece. It was never exactly clear what the relationship was, but when Harriet Tubman went to South Carolina, she asked Frances if she would take her into the Seward house for the duration of the war, because she knew that Frances would raise her just the way she was raising her daughter Fanny. She would give her lessons in religion, and she would teach her to read and write. She would teach her how to dress properly and prepare her, as Harriet Tubman saw it, for what would be, Margaret's life in a free America. But the family, the family, Harriet's descendants, and the subsequent research that was done about Margaret indicates that she was the daughter of a free couple. She was not a slave in Maryland. But Harriet Tubman desperately wanted a daughter of her own. And the speculation in the family and other places is that she brought this girl north because she knew she could have, she had a decent life in Maryland, but she could have a better life in the north, and that she had all these fancy friends who would help her. So there's a long, the research is still going on about who Margaret really was, but that much we do know.
Hmm. And could you tell a bit about Fanny or Franny? That's such a touching
Yeah. So
story.
she was the Seward's, they had three sons and then Fanny. And Fanny was really the favorite of everyone in the family. She was very shy and rather awkward and not beautiful like her mother, but highly intelligent. And she wanted to be a writer, and she kept a diary from the age of, I think, about 15 on. So we have the diary, and Fanny's diary is revelatory too. And she was just the sweetest young woman. And she always she adored both of her parents. She must have been privy to the real tension in that marriage. I mean, it was not a secret, but she was never critical about either parent. And she just tried to do her best, but also her politics, so her mother, her health wasn't good. And so her mother basically homeschooled her and gave her quite a lesson in reformist politics. So Fanny, was a deep abolitionist, and she didn't like it when men were patronizing to women. And she's quite funny about that too. So anyway, that just provides yet another voice. And then late in the book there, I won't give it away, but there's a really horrifying chapter where Seward is attacked, and Fanny is there, and she writes all about it. And it's by far the most vivid account that we have of that attack.
Wow. And can you talk a little bit about the family sheets?
Oh, Martha's family, the family
Yeah.
sheets. Yes, I love the family sheets. So that's what her wider, she was very close to everyone in her family who were spread. Many of them were in Philadelphia, but many were still in Nantucket, where the Klan had first begun, in the 1700s. So, and these were Quakers, and so they were all very open-minded. They were all anti-slavery. And Martha was known as the writer in the family. And so she expressed herself almost every day after the children were in bed, in these long letters to Lucretia Mott, who would read them and then pass them along to her brothers and sisters and their mother in Philadelphia, and then they would go on to Nantucket. So she was so funny, and Lucretia had many wonderful gifts, including her ability to just speak extemporaneously. But Martha was the writer. And so she would have funny remarks. Like, she described one scene one day when she was still a young housewife, and another housewife, she loved puns, and another housewife had told her, "Oh, you should try beating your eggs with a quill." And so Martha thought, well, all right, I'll give it a try. So, she grabs it from the long end, and she starts beating the eggs. And she said it made a hideous mess. The yolk is dripping off the feathers. And she's writing this to Lucretia, and she said that, the idea must have been invented by a goose. My nice wire egg beater is good enough for me. So that's just one tiny little glimpse into, she would take her rage at her fate and being, sort of locked into the kitchen effectively, and just turn it into these wonderful, scenes right out of Dickens or someone. And so at one point, Lucretia told her, was quite stern. She said, don't cultivate mirthfulness at the cost of other faculties. And Martha wrote back, people love to laugh. If it weren't for the blessed organ of mirthfulness, what would become of us all? And that's just one of my favorite quotes in the whole book. What indeed would become of us all?
It's wonderful. And both women go through so much during the war as they follow the progress of their sons who are fighting and who, Will Seward gets both wounded and I can't remember the order of this, but he also becomes very ill. Doesn't he have typhoid
Yeah,
fever?
they both got typhus. Yeah.
Yeah.
No, it was terrifying, and more young men died of illness than died of wounds in the Civil War because there were no sanitary,
Yeah.
conditions of any kind. And both young men fought in crucial battles. That one of my chapters is all about Willie Wright, who fought at Gettysburg, and that he was part of the he was part of the Battle of Little Round Top and all of that. And again, just piecing together, firsthand accounts from people in his battery, I was able to tell, a version of the story of the Battle of Gettysburg that, just had, and from the archives, there was an unsigned account by a young man in his battery who wrote all about it in just minute detail, hour by hour, beautifully written. And Willie Wright almost died. And so I have the account of, then I went to Gettysburg and I got a wonderful guide to explain what, sort of give me the lay of the land and what Pickett's charge was like as it came right toward Willie Wright. It's just unbelievable. And then Will Seward too was badly wounded in two battles, and one of them, Cold Harbor, and then another one, the Battle of Monocacy, which most people have never even heard of, was really one of the crucial defensive maneuvers of the war. It protected Washington from being besieged by the Confederates. So these are pretty, in order to bring the Civil War to life again, think of tens of thousands of books have been written on the subject, so it was a bit daunting. But if you can figure out how to tell it from a personal perspective that hasn't been told, I think that's kind of the key.
Oh my God. Yes, absolutely. I recall, and I cannot remember which battle this was, but the young men put their names on a piece of paper and their addresses and, somehow sewed it or pinned it to their uniforms.
That was Cold Harbor. And again, this was a crazy offensive ordered by Grant. And they just, marched straight into what they knew was this pit full of Confederate soldiers. And they were just shot one after the other. And they were using their friends' bodies as sandbags. It's just, hard for us to.
Yeah. I'm getting messages to wrap this up, but one more comment from an attendee. I love Dorothy's use of archival materials as pieces of the puzzle, diaries, journals, letters. They are the best to hear the personal perspective. So I think that's a wonderful summation of how involving and moving this book is. We're just about ready to sign off here. There are all kinds of links in the chat for using bookshop.org or the local bookshop in Brattleboro and Putney, Antidote Books, for getting hold of this magnificent tome. Also, there are links after you leave for donations and seeing who the sponsors are. These sessions have been recorded, and if you want to revisit them or any sessions that you may have missed, those will be posted in the near future. They have to be edited and put online. Dorothy, thank you so much. This has been absolutely wonderful. We are delighted to have you at the Lit Fest and look forward to your next book.
Thank you so much, Stephanie. This is great. And thank you to the audience too.
Yes, thank you all. All right, have a wonderful evening, well deserved, and we'll be in touch. Thank you.
Thank
Bye.
you. Bye.